This was like one of the cutesiest little monster romance books that I read this year. Making my little feet, blushing with my chubby little cheeks. That's good. Because Miss Hazelwood has a degree and works in neuroscience, I believe, and so that means that she knows exactly how to get the chemicals in your brain to just throw sparks at each other, make the chemicals go. Okay, I read it, so you don't have to, but you probably should. So we have Misery and Hello. Misery is like a vampire, but she doesn't like that about herself, and so she has been living in it's like the human region of the area, and she works in IT. Her daddy is like the head lead governor, president of the vampire faction, the local chapter. Hello is the new and incoming leader of the local werewolves. If you can imagine, true to vampire and werewolf lore, they don't like each other, but in order to keep peace between the two groups, they like trade a hostage of sorts to each other. Now, here's the kicker. Recently, they traded off hostages and they need a new one. And so Misery's father, who just doesn't care much for her, clearly as a person, decides that she is going to be the new hostage. So he comes and gets her from her IT job, where she is honestly kind of thriving, but also a little bit not. He tells her, surprise, you are going to become the new hostage, and you're going to do that by marrying the new leader of the werewolves. And she's like, okay, yeah, I'll do it, because it turns out that her best friend in the entire world was recently kidnapped, and she has a feeling that like some of these people in leadership, they might have something to do with it. They get married, and she has to move in with this guy just like right off the bat. And but he's like pretty nice to her. He's got like this big house. She's kind of like minding her business, doing her own thing, sleeping in the closet like you do when you're a vampire living in a house full of werewolves. That being said, in a perhaps lapse of judgment, Lo decides to let his niece get pretend kidnapped because they're trying to figure out like if there's like a rat amongst them. Misery witnesses this and she freaks out and she goes on the offensive, and then she gets shit on for that because she ends up kind of like ruining their whole sting operation. But do you blame her? Like, I don't think you should use your niece for that. It's just me. He's hot enough that we forgive him. He does end up telling Lo about her friend's disappearance because at first she was very apprehensive and suspicious of him, but then she realizes that they kind of might have some common goals because there's clearly some underhanded things going on in the werewolf side of their government and maybe on the vampire side of hers, considering her friend went missing and her dad was weird and sold her off to this guy with like no reservations. And you, as the plot is unfolding, there's just like the slowest of slow burn with these two kids, these two crazy kids. There's like this one part where he tells her that they have to like sell, of course, that they are in love. And so he has to mark her while they're in the cockpit of the airplane that he knows how to fly. And he just like rubs himself all over her. Like if it was real, I would call the police. But for them, I love it. We're like working together to kind of figure things out. Suss out who the potential traitors are in the werewolf faction. She's trying to suss out again where her friend has gone. Ends up getting like actually poisoned while she has snuck down to the kitchen for a little midnight snack one day. Thankfully, Lo is right there to provide medical assistance, and unfortunately for them, but fortunately for us, she's gonna have to feed, because she's a vampire, mind you, she's gonna have to feed on him more frequently in order to speed up the healing process. So they have the hots for each other, and I have the hots for them. But as they're going to the next step in their collective investigation, she ends up getting kidnapped. Okay, she's taken back to her childhood home because it turns out her dad was the piece of shit that he had shown himself to be from the beginning when he sold off his daughter. Okay, it turns out that her friend was half werewolf, and she was nervous that when she went through this weird like adult puberty that werewolves go through, that she wouldn't survive it because she's half human, half werewolf. So she had distanced herself from Misery because she didn't want her to be like super devastated if she were to pass away. Her father had kidnapped her friend and then kidnapped her because he wanted to draw her husband out so that he could take over the werewolf faction via the power vacuum that would have been left by his. It turns out that her daddy is also the person that poisoned her, so he literally tried to his own daughter because he thought that her husband, now that he had caught feelings for her, would be so grief-stricken that he would be able to manipulate him. And that when that didn't work, now he's like, well, I'll just kidnap my own daughter, draw out her husband, and dispose of him. And at the end of the day, Misery's brother ends up coming to the rescue. There's a whole kerfuffle where all are able to escape. Her brother, who is overall a nice guy, is able to take over from her piece of shit father. Misery thinks that Lo didn't really like her all this time because they are interspecies, so there's no way that they could possibly like be mates or soulmates or anything like that. But turns out that's all bullshit because this is a fantasy book and they're really in love. They communicate like adults and then they have very special times together and they live happily ever after. The plot, the vibes, the characters, it was so fun. It was so cute. It was so darling. And if you like, listen to the Cliff's Notes and the cringiest quotes, you should listen to my podcast called Read It and Screech, where I do this only better. Also, comment if you loved it, comment if you hated it, and like and follow for more.